I think we have it all now. We begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you once again for all your many blessings. We ask that you send your Holy Spirit upon our last class, our last lecture of this first course, Fundamental Principles in Catholic Bioethics, that you may inspire us to seek always your divine will in our lives as we search for our human origins and also seek to uphold the dignity and the sanctity of all human life. We pray for Monica's cousin and for her family at this time of loss, for all your people, especially those in most need of your divine mercy. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Well, welcome back, and to our last lecture of the first semester. You have persevered so far, and I thank you for that. All right, because it's always a journey and an adventure. So this last lecture, I don't really have a handout for you. It's a little more speculative, and I don't expect a summary either. All right. But you're welcome to take the notes, and I will send you the PowerPoint at the end of the lecture and the video also. You've been able to access the video and everything is everything is working okay? All right. So there's one detail on when so anyone can have a YouTube account. You can have a YouTube account, right? And I use it to upload the videos, but then there's another button that says publish or private, right? And if I don't push the publish button, then it remains private, but I see it. And so I have no problem when I send out the link, I look at my email and I see it. And I say, okay, great, it worked. But if I forget to push that publish button, then a day or two later, the students are sending me emails. We can't see the PowerPoint, what happened to the video? And it's because I forgot to push that publish thing. Similar to here, you know, the last thing is also record on this computer. So it's saying technicalities, but thanks be to God, we have all this technology because it makes it accessible. At any rate, now this class is going to be integrating what we have been learning so far on the scientific side and on the theological side or biblical side, all right? So this is really the lecture that seeks to delve a little more in detail of our human origins phylogenetically, meaning as a species as a whole, right? The Homo sapiens, what we will call Homo sapiens in the Linnaean classification, in the scientific classification. I'm going to pick up a little bit of what I covered last class with the Bible, but the last class was a little more general introduction, and also to highlight that if we take the text literally, right, in a fundamentalistic interpretation, what happens is we run into all kinds of problems, contradictions, even things that we wouldn't really consider God asking us, like mutilating our bodies, and also with regards to the story of creation of the human, which is the bone of contention, right? We see, first of all, that's only appears in the supposed contradiction or controversy is only in the book of Genesis. Of the 73 books, no other book has really in principle any problem with evolution or natural selection. It's the book of Genesis, and of the book of Genesis, it's only really chapters 1 and 2 about the creation of man and the creation of the universe, right? Or the really chapter 1 of Genesis. But then if we look at the text, we see all these other humans appearing all of a sudden without a specific creative act. So we really run into problems if we interpret the Bible literally or in a fundamentalistic way. So what's the alternative? Not to do that, like I said, we look for the sensus plenior. Well, that gives us an opening then in not sticking to the literal meaning of the words as they are today. Particularly, one that is a key word is day, right? The 6 days of creation. That noun day If we interpret it as a 24-hour thing, we're definitely going to be a shipwreck. We're going to run aground because it's not going to work with the scientific evidence of what we see in nature, all right? But if we interpret that day as a time, as a period of time, then it works. Anyway, just a little anticipation of what I'm doing today. I'm going to go into more detail of that first chapter of Genesis and then chapter 2, and try to fit in or suggest where we can fit in the anthropology of the human, and to see whether it actually matches and correlates to the sequence, okay? All right, so questions or comments from previous time? No? All right, let's go forward now. I'm going to talk about a little bit of mythology. All ancient cultures have had a mythology. In other words, their interpretation of origins, of how they came about, civilizations. We find this in the Hindu cultures, in the Egyptians, in Babylon, in even the Romans and the Greeks, the Chinese dynasties, here in Mesoamerica, all the primitive cultures. They all have a mythology, meaning a way of explaining their origins that is precisely mythological. It's not tied to nature necessarily, or to a scientific interpretation of nature, rather, because all of these cultures are pre-scientific in the sense that we know science today as a very systematic and objective way of analyzing and interpreting nature, right? So in these pre-scientific societies, what was most evident was just what they saw. What they saw with a plain sight. And so they tried to interpret that and try to make some sense out of their existence at that particular time. So Israel, or the Jewish people, are not exempt from a mythology also, which is mostly from an oral tradition, but it's part of, if you will, the Hebrew culture. Even the Bible comes out, well, especially the Old Testament comes out of the Hebrew culture, but they also have a mythology, meaning a belief of origins in addition to what is written in the book of Genesis, okay? And this is what I found as I was doing my research online. It is that ancient Israelites saw the universe made up on the ground as a flat disk, all right? And this is very common with other cultures of the time, this flat earth. Even today, there is still a flat earth society. I don't know if you've heard about it, but they're kind of, it's a group of mostly cynical people who are still stubborn. But the point is that it's what we see, you know, we just look at it, we see flat. And so why think of anything else? And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, you know, but they say, well, how about the satellites that take pictures of the Earth as round and so forth? It says, well, that's all made up. That's science fiction. That's manipulation on the internet. And I'm not on the satellite sitting there and looking down, so I don't believe it, that kind of thing. But anyway, the flat Earth, even though today is something kind of comical, back then was the standard. To the point that even in the Roman and the Greek cultures, this issue of flat, well, except for the Greeks did have a concept of a round earth, okay, because of shadows, and there are such great mathematicians and physics people that they figured out because of the shadow and the movement of the celestial bodies, it's a circular earth that we live on. However, in the Romans, there is, and the Greek mythology also, the Mediterranean as it opens up to the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know if I mentioned here or in what class I mentioned, this, but that opening of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, you have the Strait of Gibraltar, right? Spain on one side, and I think is it Morocco on the other side, right? And their promontories of rock is very arid, right? So you have this bare rock, and those two promontories of rocks are called in Greek and Roman mythology the columns of Hercules, the columns of Hercules, okay? And one of the works of Hercules was to push those columns apart so as to open the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, or vice versa. I forget which was the lower level. Mm-hmm. And after that, it was called in Latin non plus ultra. Non plus ultra meaning there's nothing beyond. And in fact, ships wouldn't even venture out there because they were afraid of falling over the edge into who knows what, right? Into some kind of chaos. And so that was truly non plus ultra, was the edge of the world, which was pretty much what they could see at the time. So something similar to that, there's a flat earth, but then there's a dome on the top, right? And that's where the celestial bodies are. But then that dome has waters above the dome. And the dome is called the firmament. In fact, the word firmament comes from firmum, which is strong or hard or firm, all right? So they needed something firm in which to kind of hang the stars or something up there. And also to hold back the flood waters, because the waters above the firmament, all right, those were flood waters. So you have floodgates. You see, there's a floodgate here, there's another floodgate here, another floodgate here. Why? Because particularly in the Middle East, you have this, it's very arid and dry, but periodically you have torrential rains. It's a downpour that just comes down. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, not The Passion of the Christ, but the one previous to that by Sefirelli is, I forget what it's, I think it's called Jesus of Nazareth. It's a long movie of several hours, okay? And it was this great Italian director, Sefirelli. But anyway, the contrast, have you seen The Passion of the Christ? I think most of you have, right? If you remember the last scene of, not the last, one of the last scenes, but the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus, and when he finally breathed his last, there is just one drop of water that comes down, right? One drop of rain, which is interpreted symbolically maybe a tear from the Father, right? And hits the ground and causes this huge tremor that breaks up the temple in Jerusalem, and everything starts falling apart inside the temple, and the curtain is rent in two according to the biblical passage. But that scene, that particular scene, is in contrast, is an opposition to the same scene in Jesus of Nazareth, which in my opinion, and I think many people agreed when they've seen the Sefirelli's movie up to The Passion of the Christ, was pretty much the best movie that had ever been made about the life of Jesus. It's called Jesus of Nazareth. It's a series of several episodes long, maybe 8 or 9 hours, something like that. But anyway, the scene of the crucifixion, when Jesus breathes his last, right? What Sefirelli has is a torrential rain, torrential downpour of water that, of course, washes the dead body of our Lord Jesus and just takes all his blood into the ground and sinks it into the ground. And the mother and John are at the foot of the cross, and they are drenched in water also, just totally soaked, all right? So it's such a contrast of the play with water. But anyway, they have these torrential downpours in the Middle East, and what it causes is, I don't know if you've ever heard the word wadi, but a wadi, let me start a little thing here. Where's word? Yes, a wadi is just like a crevice on the ground where the water runs down torrentially because there's no time for the water to channel nicely and so forth. So you can imagine a arid terrain that has a lot of rock and loose sand and whatnot. When these downpours happen, it just carries away a lot of mud and soil and dirt, right? And it causes these crevices on the hillside and also the wadis. And they're mentioned as part of the Hebrew culture, and they're very attuned to it because it could wash people away. It could wash a town away. You had to be careful when there was these torrential downpours. It was dangerous. Okay, anyway, why am I saying this? Oh yeah, because they had to figure, well, that water had to come from somewhere, right? And it was coming from, because they look up at the sky and it's blue, clear sky, like in Colorado. I don't know if you've ever been out to the Midwest. And my brother and sister-in-law used to live in Boulder, and they have this blue sky that we seldom get here because of all the humidity we have. But when it's dry, that dryness sucks out all the humidity from there, including the clouds. So they figured that this water was coming from the water above the firmament, and it would come through these floodgates that God would open those floodgates periodically and let down the water. Okay, this is part of their mythology, which was in common for the region in the Middle East. Several cultures have something similar. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are the heavens above, and then there is below the earth is the Sheol, which is a Hebrew word, which is the abode of the dead, all right? It's not equivalent to hell, even though in Western culture it has been translated into hell. For example, in the Creed, when we say that our Lord Jesus descended into hell precisely after his crucifixion and his death and before his resurrection, right? On the Saturday, on the Shabbat, his cadaver rested on the tomb in respect to the Sabbath, to the tradition of the Sabbath of the rest. So the cadaver of Jesus rests on the tomb, the body of the Jesus. But the soul of Jesus, the spirit of Jesus, according to our belief and our creed, goes into Sheol, all right? Goes, and we say, descendum in inferi. Inferi, the translation, the unfortunate translation of Sheol into Latin is inferi, and inferi is where we get infernum, which is the infierno, which is the hell, all right? But inferi originally in Latin is not a hell, but the inferior, okay? Inferi or inferi. We don't know exactly how Latin was pronounced because it's a dead language and we have no one from 2,000 years ago to pronounce it for us. At any rate, it is the inferior part, and so Sheol is the underneath, the crust of the earth, right? And who resides there? The dead. And the dead, but the dead is not the damned, all right? It's not hell in that sense. And so what Jesus does to go to, by going into Sheol, is to rescue the just and the unjust. Because what had happened in our mythology, in our Judeo-Christian mythology, after the fall of Adam and Eve, what happened? God placed an angel at the entrance of Eden, and it's closed. Paradise was closed, all right? Symbolic that we were in expectation from the fall of Adam and Eve, of the first humans. We had this issue of original sin that had to be purged. And so that had to be done with the new Adam, Jesus, precisely. So for centuries, millennia, we don't know how long because we don't know how far back the humans started, but all those people who died before the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus were just waiting. We're in a holding tank, and the holding tank is Sheol. Both the just and the unjust, they were just waiting there. It's a very beautiful passage on Holy Saturday from what we call the liturgy of the office of readings that we do, the clergy, on behalf of the lay people, right? And it's a meditation on Saturdays, an anonymous homily, right, that dates back centuries, and it is about the descent of Jesus into Sheol, all right? And when he descends into Sheol, the first one he finds, this is on Holy Saturday, right? After the crucifixion and before the resurrection. The first one he finds is Adam. And when Adam sees Christ already, his glorified spirit, all right, he hits his chest and he says, "My Lord and my God," recognizing him as God, right? And Jesus extends his hand to Adam and he says, "Come, grasp my hand." I'm paraphrasing. "Come, let us go out of this place," which is the abode of the dead, because there's no longer a need, right? And in fact, when you read the resurrection accounts, the last verses of all the Gospels, after the resurrection, after the death of Jesus, it says that the tombs were open and the dead rose, the souls rose from the tombs. Okay, there's this all apocalyptic and allegorical reference to the tombs opening as Jesus dies, tombs opening and dead rising, which is a reference to this whole mythology of Sheol, which was a holding tank. All the just and the unjust were waiting there since the first human, represented as Adam and Eve, just waiting for redemption. And when redemption finally happened, historically 2,000 years ago in Palestine, what is today the state of Israel, then there's no longer need for that, because then there is the individual judgment of heaven, purgatory, or hell, all right? And then eventually that final judgment for the remaining of us, whoever is going to be around for the second coming. Okay? So you see, it's very mythological, very eschatological. There's mystery, but they had to represent this somehow and come to grips with it. And so that's the abode of the dead, the Sheol of the Hebrew people, which was underneath the crust of the earth. And it made sense because people were buried and that's where they stayed and so forth. Okay. All right, which is another point of this old issue of burying the dead, which I'll bring up later one last time. So just to give an example of this kind of setup with a flat earth and water and these bodies of earth floating or standing on top of the water, and there's water above and water below and water flowing through. Here is a tablet from Babylon that is a map of the world. It's considered one of the earliest maps of the world, all right, about 500 BC. Oops. Yeah, 500 centuries before Christ. Yeah, 5 CBC, 5 centuries before Christ. And it depicts 7 islands. Interesting, because 7 was a full number, apparently not just for the Hebrew people, but maybe from Babylon also for surrounding cultures. 7 is very significant. It represents fullness. So this would have been the fullness of the earth, represented in the 7 islands. And they are floating in salt water, which is evident because they just need to get to the shore and taste the water, and it's salty, which is different from the water that is fresh falling, or if you want to call it, the rain would be sweet water as opposed to salt water from the ocean. Okay, so obviously 2 different kinds of waters, right? They had no clue of evaporation and condensation and cloud formation or anything like that. They just thought that these 2 waters are separate. Okay. So you see there is a river also running through, which I'll bring up this tablet again a little further down as we go into the chronology of Genesis 1. But it's interesting to see that this Babylonian map, which is one of the oldest maps of the world, represents chunks of earth, represented as islands, floating on top of the ocean, the salt ocean, which is something similar to what the Jewish people had. Okay, let me move forward. There are 2 models of creation for ancient Israel. This comes to us from the cultural anthropology, so study this. And there is the Logos and the Agon. The Logos and the Agon. The Logos, which is Greek for speech. God speaks, is the Dabar. Actually, in Hebrew, it would be Dabar, which is the word. Dabar is word or speech in Hebrew, and God speaks. All right, we see that theme is prevalent, especially in Genesis 1, but also in Genesis 2. Genesis 1, God says, and it's a creating word, right? God says, and it happens. God says, and it happens 6 times, and then on the 7th he rests. Then in Genesis 2, there's a dabar also, but it's a little different. God is in dialogue with the human. So it's a different dimension of the word of God. But it's also involved in creation. At any rate, when God speaks, it happens. And there's a psalm, for example, which again comes from the Old Testament. By the word of Yahweh, the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth, all their hosts. He gathers up the waters like a mound, stores the depth in vaults. Right? So you see there's a lot of reference here in this psalm to this mythological representation of ancient Israel belief. The representation of the ocean, the dome, the river. Water is very involved, the primordial water. Water have a symbol of creation, of origins. The other tradition, the Agon tradition, is more of a struggle. This one is not a struggle. This is a free-flowing thing on the part of God, right? Of Yahweh is his word that is creative. Whereas the other one, the Agon, is a struggle, and God battles with these monsters that are sea monsters. And this is to establish his sovereignty. And we'll pick up on this Agon model a little further down about the monsters. They happen to be 4 and so forth. But the big takeaway here is that both these models involve these primordial waters, which is symbolic of not just H2O, but origins and life. Okay, now, along these lines, I want to talk a little bit, again, interspersing some technicalities, the issue of words that are univocal and not univocal, okay? Univocal means that it has a single meaning. Vocal is a word or speech or sound, voice. Vocal is a word. Uni is single, okay? So the words that have a single meaning are called univocal. Univocal. But words that have several meaning, right, are not univocal. And many words, many nouns are like that. For example, if I say bear, bear in English has many different meanings, right? First of all, it depends on how it's written, and also it depends on the context. So for example, I can say bear, and you can think of what? A bear, but what kind of bear? An ursus, an animal bear, right? Okay, so that's B-E-A-R. That's bear, is the ursus, is the animal, okay? Grizzly bear, polar bear, smoky bear. All right, but there's also to bear a burden. I can bear a burden, all right? So we don't know which bear we're talking about until we put it in context. The bear can bear a burden. For example, in Pope Benedict's coat of arms, I don't know if you notice, he has a little bear in it, and it's got a backpack. The bear has a backpack on his back, all right? And that's an ancient German tradition, Teutonic tradition, that it's some kind of mythology that there was this pilgrim going along and he couldn't carry his bag because he was very tired. And so a bear came by and offered to carry the bag for the pilgrim, all right? And so the bear carries the bag. And that's in German mythology. And so Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, when he was elected Pope, he felt that he was going to carry the burden of the church. And having been prefect of the Congregation for the Faith for almost 20 years under John Paul II, he knew very well the burden of the church, because practically everything that was happening in the church was going through his desk, in addition to John Paul II, okay? And so he figured, humanly speaking, it is a big burden. And so he had the little bear with a backpack. So that's the bear, that bear is a bear. It's got both meanings in there. Anyway, but there's also, right, there's bear. Is another expression of bear. okay? And so we don't know unless we put it in the context. And so that is true also with many languages throughout the world, and particularly in ancient languages, many words are not univocal, right? It has to be in the context. Give you one example here that I use quite a bit with regards to time in Greek. We have a single word for time, all right? But the Greeks have at least these two words, chronos and kairos. And I like it a lot because they represent something different about time. Chronos is the chronological time that we're used to, the passage of minutes and hours and days and years and millennia, which is chronological, right? It's sequential. And each segment is the same measure as the next segment. So for example, all minutes have 60 seconds, right? And all days have 24 hours and so forth. Okay, so that's chronological time. It's kind of very horizontal and uniform. But kairos is a special type of time. It's a time of joy, it's a time of sorrow, it's a time of fear, of mystery. It's more of an emotional time, if you will, and it's a symbolic time. And I make the little contrast. For example, now coming up to the Christmas season, we're expecting family and friends perhaps to come. Maybe they're coming into town from another part of the town or from another state or from another country. Okay, my brother and sister-in-law in New Zealand right now. And so we have this expectation of their arrival, and they may be arriving tomorrow, but it feels like forever. By the time we get to tomorrow, it feels like a year before we get to tomorrow, okay? Because we're just expecting these people that we love very much. And so that's one type of time that is kind of stretched out when we're expecting something that hasn't arrived yet, very joyful. On the other hand, let's say the family and friends do arrive and they're here for a week and we have all our Christmas festivities and so forth. They stayed a whole week and now they're back to Alaska, and it felt like a day, right? It was, the perception was that it was so short. They were actually here a whole week, but it felt very short because we did a lot of stuff in between and we miss each other, and so it was crunched, right? So you see, that's kairos. We don't have a word for that in Spanish or English that I know of, many other languages, but the Greeks had it. The same with day, right? So you see where I'm going. I'm going toward saying that day in the Hebrew, at least in Genesis 1, is not a chronological day, all right? It's not univocal. It's yom in Hebrew, but it can also represent a period of time, So if we're not stuck to a fundamentalistic interpretation of day, then we can attribute to day still being faithful to the meaning. You know, it's not talking about trees or money. It's talking about time. Day is talking about time. So if we stay within the context of time, we can think that it's a period, it's a time period, all right? That's all I'm trying to say there. And if we do that, then imagine what it gives us. Then the window opens for interpreting Genesis 1, the first chapter of Genesis, sequentially, and then we can look at that sequence now that we're not hung up with it was actually a day of 24 hours. What happens on that sequence, if we look at the sequence itself, it matches in the big picture what we would consider the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of human life, all right, in that big picture. So let's try to look at that. In the beginning, Bereshit. Bereshit is the first words of the Bible, again in Hebrew. Means in the beginning. All right. What do we have in the beginning? When God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland. All right. This is a philosophical concept that we'll want to come back to. And darkness covered the abyss, while the mighty wind swept over the waters. So you see, there are elements here, but these are mythological elements, right? If God is creating, none of this can be before God creates. Because otherwise, these things were already around. Who created these things? Who created this water and this wind and this abyss and this wasteland, right? So this is all an allegorical way of saying that the nothingness that was before the creation was a chaos, all right? A chaos in the sense of disorder. And what God is going to do, he's going to order. He's going to put order in creation. And the actual creative activity of God is this ordering of things, which is really, it's a philosophical concept. And so now we pick up on the Logos tradition. God said, about the word of God, and the word of God is effective. It's one of the Psalms says, the word of God is not without effect. In other words, if God says something, it will happen because he is the creator, right? So it's all about attributing to God a creativeness, the power to create. All right, so God says, let there be light. And it could have been, let there be animals. Why didn't he start with humans? Let there be humans first. But he didn't. He started with light, right? And God saw how good the light was. Then God separated light from darkness. See? Ordering. Because the darkness is still representing the chaos, the disorder. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. But there's no real reference here to a day as a chronological 24-hour thing. So why are people interpreting that way? Because they're being fundamentalistic about the Bible, even without knowing it, all right? So evening came and morning followed the first day. In a pre-scientific society or culture, wake up in the morning, they see day. At night, they see darkness, right? If this is a representation of the most accepted model of the origin of the universe, which has two phases, the first phase, which is called inflation, and the second phase, which is called expansion. And what's interested in that physically, all right, with the scientific rigor that we have today, of course, this is a speculation. It's based mostly on this blue circle here that is called the background radiation. This inflation must have taken place within nanoseconds of the origin of the explosion of the Big Bang, which again in physics they call it singularity, from the definition of a point, not a dot, all right, but a point mathematically, single, that one dimension. All right, so this moment of singularity and an inflation, which is within nanoseconds, but we see if we introduce even the term of nanoseconds, it means that time is beginning to happen. So it's the origin of time, but it's also the origin of place simultaneously. And Einstein was the one who promoted that integration between time and place simultaneously. If we think about it, we cannot be in a time without being in a place, and vice versa. We cannot be in a place without being in a particular time. Okay, for example, the time that we're here now in this particular place, we would think that locally we haven't moved. We're in the same place in a different time from when we started the class. But that's strictly locally to this area here. But if we put this area in relation to the rotation of the Earth, we're no longer at the same place in regards to the rotation of the Earth. The Earth has moved somewhat already from the time that we started the lecture. And that's just with regards to the rotation of the Earth itself. If we also consider that at the same time that the Earth is rotating, the Earth is also translating around the sun, we have moved in another dimension also, not just within the sphere, but also the sphere itself has moved around the solar system, around the sun, an X amount of space. And even that, the whole solar system itself is also rotating within the Milky Way, and the Milky Way within the universe in the expansion model and so forth. So really what prevails is not static, but dynamic, is movement all the time. And that moving happens within time inexorably. If there is a displacement in place, there's going to be a displacement in time also. So they're really, and that's why Einstein really talked about space-time dimension, all right? Anyway, this is the standing model, and you can see that there's a gradual development here. Within the first nanoseconds, really what has been created is time, but also simultaneously space as this immense, indescribable explosion occurs. And now the next step that happens is that the subatomic particles begin to coalesce. We're talking about the level of quarks that then coalesce further into the classical subatomic particles of protons, neutrons, and electrons, but also the antimatter of positrons and so forth. And then they also start coalescing into atoms. And when we get to atoms, right, the first atom being helium, hydrogen, just one proton and one electron orbiting around, it's a charge issue. It's simply a charge issue of positive and negative. But then we get to atoms, the very first atoms, we have already a tremendous amount of stability in matter, all right? Because now we have particles, atomic particles that are relatively stable, but still dynamic. Those atoms continue to coalesce into larger and larger atoms and so forth. And eventually we get all of the atoms of the universe, that whole table there, right? Okay, but all this happens within the first nanoseconds that then eventually become seconds into minutes, and minutes is extremely long. When we go from a scale of nanoseconds into minutes, the scale, we have shifted so many orders of magnitude that everything looks like it's slowing down to a still, like nothing's happening, okay, like a very slow motion. That deceleration, if you will, continues with regards to time, but space continues to expand into the second half of the model, what is called the expansion model, for the next 13.5 billion years. So you notice how the scale changes into from nanoseconds, extremely short time, to extremely long time in the measure of billions of years. And this is the best estimate, close to 14 billion years that the Big Bang happened, all right? Anyway, all this to flesh out in a model of let there be light, of the creating activity of let there be light, okay? Okay, and this is what light meant, the whole of the universe as we know it, which continues to expand, and it's actually, you notice that this expansion is not cylindrical, but it's conical, right? And you notice that even the cone, you notice a curvature here, which is going to be a parabolic curvature. This is the beginning, which would be like the lag phase. And the best estimate, so we are here now, right? The best estimates is that the universe continues to expand, but it's accelerating in the expansion. Accelerating is counterintuitive, right? We think that after a while, it's almost like a rubber band. You stretch it out to the maximum, and then it's going to start unstretching, decelerating back to origin. No, apparently, God knows why. But it is, we're just observing. This is the observation, especially once we were able to get, whatever it takes, whatever we see, telescopes outside of the sky, outside of the dome, okay, when we broke through the floodwaters, the floodgates, we're able to get out into space and be able to take better photograph of the universe and the galaxies and so forth, because here the problem is all the noise we get from the atmosphere. It's a lot of noise, interference, and it's very difficult to see outside of the atmosphere with these huge telescopes. But once, like the Hubble, for example, and other telescopes that are being sent out there outside of the atmosphere, then they have a much clearer picture of the universe, and over time, the scientific evidence from astrophysics is that the universe is not only continuing to expand, but accelerating. And that's why it's represented with the cone shape of that acceleration. What is to come, who knows? But if this is a parable, we know that it accelerates into infinity. Approaching infinity is asymptotic. It never actually touches, right? So who knows what will happen with time and space in the future? Can they expand infinitely? This is from the scientific perspective. So really, the best that we can say is that it's a lot that we don't know. It's a lot that we don't know. We're just observing and documenting what we're observing, but it leaves a lot of questions open. On the faith side, we know that all of this, as mysterious and beautiful and overwhelming as it may be, with the billions of galaxies that are in here, which, by the way, you know, when we look out at night and we see stars, right? We see little dots, and some are brighter dots and some are dimmer dots. And generally, we can kind of put two classifications, the brighter dots and the dimmer dots. Neither of those are stars, like the sun is a star, okay? But the brighter dots are actually planets that are reflecting the light of the sun. So they're opaque bodies, similar to the moon. And typically Saturn or Mars, Jupiter are the ones that we see with plain sight as the bigger stars. Not stars at all, they're actually planets. The little dim dots, they're not stars either. They're billions of stars together into galaxies, but so far away that they look like a single dot. There's that old exercise, remember, at night, two persons with a flashlight each, and the third, we're standing here, and that person is, those two persons are over there. They each have a flashlight, they turn it on, and we see two dots, two white dots, right? And then we walk away from each other, and those two little dots get closer and closer together simply because of the perspective. So they get closer together. There comes a point, if we're far away enough from those flashlights, from those two flashlights, that those two dots actually merge into one tiny little dot. And they've kept the distance. There's still two flashlights, but they're so far away they look like a single dot. So that's the same that happens with the galaxies, with the suns that are so far away in the solar system that they look like single dots. And while I'm on this, I might as well talk about the light year. It's another good example of time and place time merging. But you know, a light year. What's your intuition? You probably know, but a light year, is that a measure of time or place or space or distance? Okay, what we call a light year is really a measure, it's not a measure of time at all, even though time plays into it, but it's a measure of distance. And light years is used, just like we use billions of years to measure time in space, we will use light years to measure distance. And what is a light year? A light year is the distance that a photon, in other words, a light particle, travels in a year. And how much is that? Well, speed of light, which is represented by c, right? Is equal to 300,000 meters per second. Meters or kilometers? $300,000 kilometers per second, okay? So in other words, in 1 second, 101, this photon that just left here is 300,000 kilometers away. In 1 second, okay? Now multiply that second times a year. How many seconds in a year? So someone can do the math and figure it out, but this is an astronomical distance, literally. It's billions and billions of kilometers of distance. And that's the measure of distance, light years, okay? So it's the distance that a photon travels in a year, and that's what is used, that's the measuring stick that is used to measure the distance between galaxies and stars and other planetary and galactic or things in the universe. Anyway, this is a mythological, chapter 1, verse 1 of Genesis is a mythological, it's an allegorical expression of what scientists are calling the Big Bang and the inflation and expansion model. Then God said, let there be a dome in the middle of the waters. Okay, so there's a dome, otherwise known as a firmament. It's firm, it's hard, all right? There's a dome in the middle of the waters, right? The water is going to be the ocean, to separate the body from one body of water from the other. Again, what's their experience? Their experience is that the ocean in Israel is on the coast, right, of the Mediterranean. The ocean is obviously salty. But the torrential waters that fell from the heavens, right, were sweet, were not salty. Mm-hmm. And so there are two different types of waters, and they have to be separated, otherwise they'd mix. And the separation is that firmament, that dome. And so here are the waters above the firmament, and these are the waters below the firmament. Okay? And then some of that water runs through rivers and so forth. Yes, they can experience those things in a pre-scientific culture. And so it happened. God made the dome, and it separated the water above the dome from the water below it. God called the dome sky. Evening came and morning followed the second day. Also, sky is interesting because when we look out to the ocean and when the Israelis looked out to the Mediterranean, they saw a blue ocean. And when they looked at the sky, they saw a blue sky. So they figured maybe salt water is just darker blue than fresh water, and fresh water is lighter blue, and it's up there. You know. And the dome is firm, but it's kind of transparent, and we can see the dome, the underneath of the dome. All right, scientifically, what do we have? We have a process of the planetary systems, the formation of the planetary systems, which is from explosion of novas and supernovas, explosions of suns and stars, and then condensation of matter. But this condensation is also swirling around, so it's an interaction of forces, of several different forces. There is a force of gravity that is pulling together the dust that is flying through the earth at some incredible speed, but they coalesce and they start forming clumps. And as the clumps continue to coalesce, they also acquire more gravity and greater pull. So gradually this pull, but the pull is also rotating because of the way that the stuff is flying through the universe. The end result is that these, it's called accretion, these accretion motions will eventually form the planetary system. So that generally all the planets within a system were formed more or less at the same time. Like our own was about 4.5 billion years ago. Of the last 13.5, all right, 4.5 billion years ago, our own planetary system. Except for exoplanets that get trapped in the system, like Pluto, for example. I think Pluto has been trapped into our planetary system, but originally was an exoplanet. It came from somewhere else and got trapped by the gravitational pull of the sun into an orbit. There are basically three general possibilities when an opaque body comes through a planetary system or near a planetary system. It has three possibilities. Either it is flung forward in acceleration because it hits the gravitational pull, but there's also centrifugal force, because of the rotation of the centrifugal, right? If we spin something and let it go, it will fly out in a straight line. Mm-hmm. And so the centrifugal force will catch that body and fling it forward at a faster speed. Is in a sense, it is in fact an acceleration through a natural acceleration through the universe. That's one possibility if it was far enough and fast enough. The other possibility is that it gets trapped into the planetary system. It's just came in at the right speed and the right angle, to balance the centrifugal force with the centripetal force of gravity pulling it in. They balance each other out. And so the net result is a circular acceleration, right? Because circular motion is a type of acceleration, but stabilized within the planetary system. And then the third option is if it's coming at too much of an angle, right? Then the gravitational pull is stronger than its speed or centrifugal force, and it will suck it into the system and essentially end up at the core, explode or get sucked into the sun, the star. Then depending on how large that system, that planet is, whether it's going to destabilize the planetary system or not, okay? But you have to think of this, even when we look outside and the stars at night and everything is in place and super static, nothing moves, not at all. That's simply because of the great distance. But when we get closer to this phenomena, there is a tremendous dynamism occurring, and everything really, literally is in motion. But the distances, again, are so far away that even within galaxies, they have done mathematical models, all right, of two galaxies going in coalition, and they actually go through each other and they come out at the other end intact, because the actual distance between the planetary systems of those galaxies is so immense that it really allows them to go through each other and come out intact at the other end. These are mathematical models, okay, of real, actual galaxy and their distances. So it gives you, it's just like the infinitesimally small, get down into the atom, into the subatomic particles and subatomic. Equivalently, infinitesimally large when we go out into space. Now, all that has to be described somehow in a pre-scientific society, so they're going to use this kind of mythological language. Separating the waters above from the waters below, second day. All right, so I'm picking up on the Agon model here, on the storytelling, because of the struggle or the fight, if you will, the battle that God does with these four monsters of chaos, okay? So again, they're mythological monsters. They represent disorder or chaos, and they are the sea, death, Tannin, and Leviathan. Leviathan, which is also represented almost like as a whale or some kind of sea creature, right? An enormous sea creature. These are the forces of chaos, basically, that God is dominating and is subjugating. Into what? Into order. Okay, so these monsters are defeated, and God is enthroned triumphant, and in a mythology surrounded by these lesser deities, which also has influence from other cultures, other Mediterranean cultures of the time. And he continues then with the speech, picking up on the Logos or the Dabar tradition. So they intermingle, these two mythologies intermingle, right? The Agon and the Logos or Dabar intermingle in different passages of Genesis. Let's look at the third day. You notice also that narrative is getting a little longer because they have to describe more things. But you see the sequence. So first there is the creation of the universe as a whole. Then they have to account for water and different types of waters, and the power of water and the mystery of water. Then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into a single basin." What is he doing? He continues to order, but there's more and more detail going on here. He still has to, God, still has to tame the waters. He has to tame the waters. So gather the waters under the sky into a single basin so that the dry land may appear. Yeah, because otherwise we just have water all over the place, and the water is restless, like the shore pounding waves of the shore. So that has to be gathered up into a basin and tamed down, essentially. And so it happened. The water under the sky was gathering to its basin, which become essentially the oceans. And the dry land appears, the continents. And you can think of Pangea, and the different tectonic plates and all that. But of course, they have no knowledge of that. But they do have a knowledge that the dry land is above the water, above the ocean. Okay, so that means that the ocean has to, and there's an ocean depth somehow that is holding this water below the dome, below the skies, is holding it in place. It's what we call today the oceans. And so the dry land is called the earth, and the basin of the water is called the sea, because what they had in front was basically the Mediterranean Sea. God saw how good it was. Then God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation. See? So he needed to have the waters tamed before he goes into this phase of vegetation, which for the ancient people is questionable whether they all understood really the life of vegetables or plant life as we understand it today as producers, because they were more static and set put. Typically, life was more evident in animals that could move, right? And had more freedom and dynamics to move. But anyway, first come the plants. And in fact, that would be the logical sequence of the beginning of life on Earth with producers first. I'll give you another detail in a minute. And you'll see how important it was that plants started the whole life cycle. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. Every kind of plant that bears seed and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. And so it happened. The earth brought forth every kind of plant that bears seed and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. God saw how good it was. Evening came and morning followed the third day. Now you notice that this last little sentence is being repeated. Evening followed and morning came the third day. And so it's just marking the day, all right? And it just repeats. So it's a mnemonic device. It's a repetition device just to set out the different times of how things are occurring sequentially. Now think about this. The primitive, okay, first before we get to the primitive atmosphere, here is a model of accretion for a planet like the Earth, which is, this accretion is chunks of dirt, rock, material, right, that is traveling through space at incredible speed. Periodically they coalesce into each other, and as they do coalesce, many of the matter that is out there is actually metal, so it's on the heavy side. They have gravity, right? And they exert gravity on surrounding things that are flying around that get sucked in more and more, and that's the accretion process, right? Of accumulating material little by little as it's flying around and being caught. It's almost like having a dry sponge move it through water vapor. Is going to pick up some of that vapor. If you continue to move that sponge through the vapor, eventually that sponge will be hydrated, right? Similar process to that. Of course, these collisions that are happening also are, the impact is strong and violent. This would be equivalent to nuclear bombs going off, okay, this impact, because of the speed of these things crushing in. When we look at the moon, for example, which was formed more or less around the time of the sun, I think the latest theory is that it was actually trapped in the orbit of the Earth, all right? And you see how it's all impacted with holes, right? It's got craters and holes that we can actually see from here, from a distance. So imagine the size of those craters that we can see at this distance. Huge. And all those meteorites are embedded inside underneath the crust of the moon. Well, essentially, we should look the same because the Earth, because a meteorite that hits the moon, we can estimate that a proportional number of meteorites have hit the Earth also. Mm-hmm. But what has saved us is the atmosphere, because the atmosphere is literally a shield. And this shield that we cannot move our hands, is so thin that we can move our hands through it, protects us by its thickness, which is maybe about 10 kilometers more or less, protects us from the impact of all these meteorites that are flying around there and trying to hit the Earth, okay, simply because of the trajectory. And essentially what happens to them is they get burnt up. They get burnt up. Because when these meteorites are coming at such an incredible speed that they hit the gases of the atmosphere, that sets it on fire and breaks it up and fragments it. In fact, some fragments get to make it all the way through the atmosphere and impact the Earth, and those are the meteorites that have been found around. You know, some pretty large, some small. Some people have gotten hit by meteorites, some have survived. It's incredible, that stuff, but that's going on all the time. Mm-hmm. And with the shooting stars, we call the shooting stars, those are also meteorites that are burning up in the atmosphere. I think December is a particular time of year for shooting stars. Mm-hmm. All right, so back to the plants, what they're calling plants. Today we would call algae, and even before algae, the bacteria, cyanobacteria, exactly, cyanobacteria. So this has to do with the primitive atmosphere. The primitive atmosphere was inhospitable, right? Was inhospitable. And the primitive atmosphere was mostly hydrogen and methane and CO2 because of all the volcanic activity and the live crust of the Earth that was forming and so forth. So it was very unbreathable. We couldn't breathe that stuff, all right? And then that was about 4.5 billion years ago. In a few, less than a billion years, excuse me, less than a billion years, about 500 million years, these inorganic materials started coming into place to form primitive organic compounds. We'll cover that in a little more detail in the environmental course in the summer, but that famous Urey-Miller experiment where they took the gases of what is estimated to have been the primitive atmosphere together with water, liquid water, and put electrical charge of sparks in there. And over time, and doing this in a cycling, kind of mimicking, for example, lightning and thunderstorms, they eventually got organic material from there, and amino acids and other organic. Oh, someone's chiming in. All right. And so eventually they got organic compounds, including amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. All right, and proteins are the ones that do the work in nature at the metabolic level. So all this to say that we have a logical sequence that can be done with starting with inorganic material and gases into organic matter, eventually into metabolism, which is another word for life at the organic level. All right, very interesting.
Also, I think that the oxygen
Yes, exactly.
I think that the atmospheres have no oxygen, or the
exactly.
The levels were really low.
Exactly. The primitive atmosphere was essentially devoid of oxygen. And at some point, life progressed, which is obviously was anaerobic life, right? Not being able to use oxygen. They were using the other chemicals. But eventually these cyanobacteria developed, right? And I remember cyanobacteria used to be classified as algae, cyanophytes. When I was studying biology in the 60s in Mexico City, high school biology, they were they were called blue-green algae, all right? There was the green algae, the blue-green algae, there's all by colors, the red algae, the rhodophytes, the phaeophytes, the brown algae, and so forth. And these guys were the blue-green algae, right? As recently as 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Now, because of their structure, they have been taken out of the algae. They're not algae at all. In fact, they don't have an organized nucleus, so they're prokaryotes, they're not eukaryotes. They are not classified in the bacteria, but they are cyanobacteria, meaning that they have photosynthetic pigmentation. And it is estimated that these cyanobacteria eventually with algae, with bacteria blooms, right, became so abundant that they essentially transformed the atmosphere, the primitive atmosphere, into the current atmosphere where we have oxygen, enough oxygen to be able to breathe, and aerobic. And so all I'm showing here is an algae bloom. So the central part of photosynthesis at the beginning of life, right, in order to allow other life, basically consumers, to come into place. But you notice that it's interesting, just staying with kind of the big picture, that the first life that comes into play, that God creates, is the plant life. It's the vegetable life, in other words, producers of food, but also, in the case of the cyanobacteria, producers of oxygen, which is going to be needed in oxidative respiration, right? In using oxygen for burning the glucose for energy. Okay, so the big picture matches the sequence. All right. Fourth thing, God said, let there be lights on the dome of the sky to separate day from night. Let them mark the fixed times, the days and the years, and serve as luminaries in the dome of the sky to shed light upon the earth. And so it happened. See, God said, and so it happened. God made the two great lights. Of course, when we look up, naturally, we see the sun and we see the moon. The greater one to govern the day, and the lesser one to govern the night. And he made the stars. Might as well throw in the other little dots. That we don't know what they are, but they're there. So we put them, they're obviously underneath the firmament because we can see them, right? This is the primitive Hebrews looking up and speaking and seeing. They had no clue back then that the sun is a luminous object and the moon is an opaque object, meaning that the sun is producing its own light, but the moon is reflecting light, not producing its own, okay? And that's why they're calling the brighter one the lesser and the dimmer one the lesser, greater and lesser. But you see, in a pre-scientific language, here are, after settling what was happening on land, and they got actual land, now they're going to settle what happened above, all right? The luminaries. Anyway, that's the fourth day, and that's also my argument why it's not a day of 24 hours, because the day of 24 hours is defined by the sun. Okay. Now, fifth day, the animals. But the animals are in two different categories. God said, let the water teem with abundance of living creatures, and on the earth, let birds fly beneath the dome of the sky. There's always that dome, right? And so it happened. God created the great sea monsters and all kinds of swimming creatures with which the water teems, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw how good it was. Again, here's the mnemonic, the repetition mnemonic. And God blessed them, saying, be fertile, multiply, fill the water of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. See, evening came and morning followed, the fifth day. So you see the repetition, standard chunks of time or sequences, events. Interesting how here also is the introduction of fertility for the first time and reproduction. So the plants, they weren't exactly sure how plants reproduced, okay? But they knew about animals, and so it comes into play here now. I just see an interplay really between the divine and the human, and the divine being patient with our human ignorance and trying to inform our ignorance into something coherent. But look at this. I find it interesting also that the first creation of animals is fish and birds, which move in a similar medium because they both move through fluids. So we have this water that is so prevalent. I'm sure that a lot of their economy depended on the water, especially around the coast, fishing and all that. It was abundant. So here's a school of fish, and you can see it's moving almost as a single body, right? This is very common in, I don't know if any of you do snorkeling or scuba, but it's a fantastic sight to see these schools of fish. I've never seen one this large, but I've seen schools of fish and they move. And look at it's a very dynamic motion, but they move as a whole, and they're so close together. It's not really known how or why or how they keep their distance, and they move like that. These are mostly jacks, I think, or pompano, but there are other species in there too. At any rate, you notice this curvature on this school of fish. The curvature is due to the bubbles of the diver who is he just placed himself down, on the bottom right and photographing this school of fish that is flying or swimming in front of him. And the column of bubbles from his tank is making that school of fish kind of go around it, right? So the bubbles, what I'm trying to say is that the bubbles break up the school, but they keep that flowing motion. So it's a flow anyway. These are animals moving through a fluid, which is a thick fluid, namely water. What do we have? The birds in the sky. This is a cloud of starling. Here's a individual starling. You've seen it around. Sometimes when the sun hits it, it shines in color. It's typically black, but it has a sheen on it. Anyway, this is a cloud of starling flying around. I don't know if you've seen this. They're more common in Latin America. You can see them in the tropics, sometimes around parks. Okay, and but this is also an animal that's moving through another fluid. It's a lighter fluid, air, but it's also a fluid. And so I just find it interesting, curious that the first two creatures that God makes, the first two animals, are animals that move through fluid, either a water fluid or an air fluid. Of course, these people didn't have a clue about the birds being derivatives of the reptiles and all that, which would be on land, right? But anyway, just a curiosity that these are the first animals and also the first time that reproduction is introduced in the narrative.
Also, you have the spores of the plants. That's actually too.
Yes,
so maybe
exactly.
They didn't know how to classify, because in the previous passage they talk about fruits and seeds.
Yes, exactly.
So
fruit
maybe
and
they
seed.
had an idea, but they didn't know that they
Right.
had spores too.
Yes, yes, exactly. Certainly the microscopic stuff, they had no clue, right? Because they weren't there yet. They didn't have the technology. But yeah, I forgot to mention, and thank you for telling me, because the fruits and the seeds, this was obviously an agricultural society. So that was the most important thing for them, was the fruit and the seed, right? Because that made the other plants come forth. Okay. So now, the fifth day. Then God said, let the earth bring forth all kinds of living creatures, cattle, creeping things, and wild animals of all kinds. And so it happened. Again, God said, it happened, same mnemonic. God made all kinds of wild animals, all kinds of cattle, all kinds of creeping things of the earth. God saw how good it was. Then in the second part of this verse, chapter 6, is where we have the creation of the human. But notice what's happened here. The living creatures are creeping things, okay? Here is a fossil of Ichthyostega, which is considered an amphibian. I'll move this guy away a little bit so you can see its tail. It has a tail that was fan tail, and even so this is what we call a tetrapod, right? Has four-legged creature, obviously alluding to land. But guess what? The tetrapod also has a fan tail and also webbed toes. Okay? And so it was estimated to be amphibian. This was a creature that was coming out of the water into land. So this is like the first migration, wave migration of animals into land and evolving into fully terrestrial creatures. Mm-hmm. We see that it comes after the creation of the fluid creatures, which was the birds and the fish, all right? So the land creatures are left for last. Again, in the order, if we follow the big sequence of evolution, the colonization of land by animals was the last to happen, right? First were marine animals. Continues on that same day, right? This is the sixth day. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and the cattle. Notice the sequence, it's very orderly, right? Created the fish first, so we have dominion over the fish first, then the birds, and then the cattle, which are on land, and over all the wild animals and all the creatures that crawl on the ground. So you notice the order. This is the priestly tradition, the priestly source, okay? Because they were in charge of having everything in order at the temple, and they were in charge of rituals, so they have to be, say, this little aside, the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist. You never heard the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist? No? Okay, well, so the liturgists are the ones who are in charge of the liturgy of the Mass, of setting the ritual, whatever ritual it is, right? And the order of the Mass and all that. The difference is very simple. The difference between a liturgist and a terrorist, you can negotiate with a terrorist. Meaning a liturgist is typically very rigorous, follows the rubric, follows the book, follows the norm, the law, and doesn't deviate because I don't have a right to change the ritual. It's a ritual that I have inherited and I have to pass on, so I don't have a right to change it. So there's no negotiation with the liturgists. These guys were liturgists. Okay, at the human level. So the Holy Spirit is being patient and cooperating with all that and still getting the divine message across, right? And this is a combination of the divine message that we are made in His image and likeness. Then, again, the mnemonic device of repeating the key point. God created man in His image. In the divine image, He created him, male and female, He created them. So interesting that our sex and gender are associated with our image in God. So it's integral to our substance, to our essence. Okay? How interesting. If, of course, the Holy Spirit knew that we would get into this gender ideology mess that we're in today, but the human, I don't think, had a clue. And there it is. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So not just the reproduction, but the dominion, all right, exclusive to the human and not given to the other creatures. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that move on earth. Again, the same sequence, you see, the order, structure, very rigorous. God also said, I give you every seed-bearing plant all over the earth, an agricultural society, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit on it to be your food. And to all the animals of the land, all the birds of the air, and all the living creatures that crawl on the ground, I give all the green plants for food. And so it happened. We think that we should all be vegetarian from this narration, from this narrative. God looked at everything He had made, and He found it very good. Evening came and morning followed, the sixth day. All right? So this is like the culmination of creation. And what I'm trying to say then is that if we stay with the big picture and don't interpret it literally, but just take the big strokes of what's happening, we see that the sequence actually matches up with the creation of the universe, the Big Bang, and then accretion, the coalescing of planetary systems and actual planets, the separation of the waters and all that. Before, there has to be a non-living order before we get life to happen. If these were creation narratives that were not respectful of nature, there's no reason why they had to maintain that order. There's no reason why they had to have the universe created first and establish the water and the dry land and all that, and then make the plants and then make the animals on land and finally leave the human for the last. But
And also, I think it's like assuring survival of the human by having had already the plants and the animals.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. So it's intuitive, right? It's intuitive, and it makes sense to have something set up first before we land, so that we can have something to live on. But so, if we look at it from this perspective, frankly, I don't see the contradiction. We just have to keep in mind those basic principles of not interpreting in a fundamentalistic way and following the sequence, trying to find the deeper meaning. Of course, the deeper meaning of it all is that we are God's image and that we're called to eternal life with God and so forth. Now, I'm going to pick up after the break. We're going to go in a break in a minute. In the second half is, how is it that we are God's image? How is it that, in qué senso, in what sense are we God's image? Mm-hmm.
Father, and also I think it's logical because, I mean, the people who wrote that, they weren't going to talk about amino acid or molecules or bacteria. I mean,
they had no clue. And that's, we have to get into.
So sometimes I think scientific people are like really liturgists.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, the evidence, because
this is impossible, of course. People living years ago, I mean, they couldn't have a clue about bacteria, about biochemistry. I mean, I think they did a lot.
Exactly.
By trying to understand.
It's amazing how much they did do with the primitive tools that they had on hand, and how these were exciting times as they were discovering more and more, and the refinement of the tools allowed them to discover more from the bigger and the smaller size. But it really is astonishing how much, how accurate they really were, right? Just from the simple observation, from the immediate simple observation. And we say pre-scientific in a clean sweep and very easily, but for us, at least for me, it's hard to get into a pre-scientific mentality, all right? Into a pre-scientific mentality of just the intuition of what I'm seeing at first sight. Mm-hmm. And yet that was their standard. That was their standard.
No, and thank God it was like that, because can you imagine in Hebrew, eukaryotes, the words? I mean, it would be impossible
That's exactly right. Yes.
A scientific Bible.
That's what we needed the Greeks for that, philosophically, because they had the philosophical tools to start explaining this and expanding our language really to cover these different realities that were being discovered. Okay, I think this is a good spot to break. Let me just take a look for a moment here. Okay, well, yeah, let's round it up to the Sabbath. Can you bear for a couple more minutes to the Sabbath? Yeah, because you notice the seventh day actually comes in Genesis 2. It's the first verse of Genesis 2. Okay, and the first verse of Genesis 2 is like a summary. Thus the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. On the seventh day, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day from all the work he had undertaken. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work he had done in creation. So, how, again, does God need to work? By definition, God doesn't work, right? Because he's the creator of work. But this is the human language to express creation, what he had done, exactly. And so this is the seventh day represented here, a nice place where we can all gather and have some rest, right? But for the Hebrew people, the seventh day is the Shabbat, which is the temple day or the synagogue day. Is a day of worship, and it's a day when the scrolls are open and read, and proclaimed, and preached. All right, so the rabbi is the preacher, and this rabbi could be Jesus or not, but it represents a rabbi who is interpreting the scrolls, the sacred scriptures, the Torah, for the people. And you notice it's very symbolic because the scroll is open, and it's only open when it's going to be interpreted, read and interpreted for the people, proclaimed. Is Dabar, right? It's God's word. He has a shawl on top of his head, and the shawl is representative of at least two layers of dimension, which is the 10th So you understand that for the Jewish people, the exile from Egypt was extremely powerful and symbolic into the promised land, right? Being rescued from slavery in a polytheistic culture like Egypt, and taken to the promised land. But that journey through the desert was mostly a nocturnal journey because the day was too hot to be walking around and melting away in the sun. And so they would rest inside the tents, under the tents during the day, and they would walk at night. That's also why the lesser luminary was the moon that allowed them to walk at night, okay? But that tent represents also, was the dwelling place of God while they were on pilgrimage. Later, the tent becomes the temple in Jerusalem with foundations and an actual permanent, supposedly permanent structure. Has been destroyed twice. But the tent, during the passage, the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, represented what is known as the Shekinah, the Holy of Holies, the dwelling place of God, the dwelling place of God. Okay, so that's the tent, which is also symbolic of the dome, because God dwelt beyond the dome, the famous dome that's been described mythologically. So the shawl of the rabbi, he wears it over his head, and he'll carry it around on his shoulders, and he'll flip it over his head when he is proclaiming. It's going to be the Torah and commenting on it, so that because that represents that he is under the cover of God and that he's representing God, all right? So that's what it represents. Today we have kind of adopted that symbolism in the domes of our churches, and especially the traditional church, the classical church that is cruciform, all right, a central nave and lateral transept, but the center is a dome, which represents the dwelling place of the Hebrew people, the Shekinah, and also the dome of creation, and the shawl and so forth is represented by that. Beyond that, in Catholic churches, sometimes you have a second layer of dome to emphasize it, which is the baldachin, St. Peter's Basilica, or columns that go up, and it's all bronze, but it looks like cloth, like black cloth with a golden rim that is draping over the main altar of St. Peter's Square, all right? It's called the baldachin. There's one at St. Patrick's in Miami Beach, if you've ever been to that church. It has a baldachin like that, which represents the shawl, the tent, the dome, that we are under the cover of God, under his protection and under the dwelling of God. Okay, all that meaning that the Sabbath was holy that way and was devoted supposedly exclusively to God. Jesus was attacked a lot for working on Sabbath, right? For healing on Sabbath. All right. Going to break there, and we'll come back about 15 minutes or so. All right. Time to thaw out a little bit.
Back in the old days when I was a child.
Yes.
I mean,
Wisdom. Exactly.
Remember that we used to have like chalina?
Yes, right. The veil.
To go to church,
exactly.
I had to wear
chalina, el velo.
And children, like the older, the adults would wear the chalina, and then for the kids, we had just a little thing like almost like the Jewish wear.
Right. They call it the yarmulke, and we call it the skull cap. And the Pope still wears a little skull cap.
Right, but children, we used to wear something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right? A little, like a mini veil. Did they have another little name? They had a local name like Chalina. Chalina was a veil. Veil for women, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all that, and even the skull cap of the Pope today is also symbolic of
conservative Catholics that do it.
Yes,
right,
some do.
The traditional line.
Yes.
But I guess later on in the 60s, that came out of
it actually, it was a norm. It was a norm in
the church.
For Mass, right? But after Vatican II, after the Second Vatican Council and the renewal of the church and all that, the reform of the liturgy, it was done away with, and it became optional. As soon as it became optional, many people dropped it.
And then we went the extreme.
Right, exactly. Now, sandals and shorts.
The dress code.
Right.
There is no dress code.
It's terrible.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
we're definitely getting into the break, so I'm going to pause recording for a minute. Okay, welcome back to the final stretch. Now we're going to get into Genesis, the book of Genesis, chapter 2. And we are moving into the second type of narrative. That is the Yahwist narrative, remember? Not the priestly one, but the Yahwist. And so I put it here, Yahweh Elohim. Remember, the vowels are added later, but that is essentially the Lord, and that was the word that they could not repeat out loud because saying the name of a person was in some way possessing the person. It gives them a familiarity, and Yahweh was totally other, so his name could not be pronounced directly. All right, so you notice here from the narrative that it's beginning a second type of narrative, precisely from the Yahwist tradition or source. This is the story of the heavens and the earth at their creation. When the Lord God, and the first time that it's used, Lord God, right, Yahweh, made the heavens and made the earth and the heavens, there was no field shrub on earth, and no grass of the field had sprouted. For the Lord God had set no rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. So again, the theme of water comes up, water as life-giving. But a stream was welling up out of the earth and watering all the surface of the ground. Mysterious passage. The first part says there was no water around. The second part says that there was a stream welling up and watering the ground. This could be an indirect reference to two of the four famous rivers of ancient Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are still there to this day. They're all channeled and so forth, but the Tigris and the Euphrates are here. So you can see they map what would be known as the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is this, depicted in green, and this is the Mediterranean. This is Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. Here is modern-day Turkey up here. And so the Middle East, this is the coast here is Syria, so this would be Israel, okay? And this is known as the Fertile Crescent. On the other side here, where the Tigris and the Euphrates empty out, the delta is the Red Sea, the Red Sea. And this whole area is known as the birthplace of Western civilization. Back then, Babylonia or Mesopotamia, precisely in between these two great rivers, this is where it's estimated that agriculture began for the Western civilization. Again, going back to the little stone map that I was showing you earlier, this one has been just painted, overlaid, color overlaid to see, again, the background of the disc, the flat disc on the ocean, resting on the ocean, which is this blue part, and then the islands sticking out, but also inside Assyria, and on this side, Babylon that goes across here. And then the blue streak in the middle is supposed to represent the Euphrates, the river Euphrates. And the hole at the center, this little hole, don't miss the hole, that is known as the Axis Mundi. That was the center of the earth, according to them, right? Center of the earth. Every civilization, every large civilization has considered itself to be the center of the earth, right? But in fact, their claim is true insofar as agriculture is concerned. It's considered that this was the beginning of agriculture here, which was very significant for humans because it represents the transition from a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherers, essentially following herds and collecting wild life for food, to settling down. Because when you have agriculture now, you can grow your own food and you don't have to be moving around much. In fact, when we say agriculture, we also mean culture in the sense that nomads have a lot of difficulty establishing any kind of material culture. They don't have much things, and even the language is going to be verbal and so forth. But when people settle down into a region, into an area, and are able to grow their own produce, first the plants, but then the animals, the herd animals that come with the plants, that can feed on the plants, right? You get a stable population living in an area. There's, in a sense, a little bit more free time. There's division of labor. They start organizing so that they manage to carve out some time to develop the language, develop the tools, and even go into art and things like this, because now they don't have to be moving around, jumping and carrying all this stuff. Instead, they're in one place, and we tend to accumulate, right? We tend to accumulate cargo whenever we are in a place. We all know that. So here it's estimated about several thousand years before the time of Christ, the origin of civilization at the agricultural level. Then philosophically and more directly to our Western culture, we can say that origin was a little further west with Greece, with classical Greece. All right, so that's a reference that could match this Babylonian map where the Euphrates is actually mapped out. And there's a reference to the 4 rivers. Remember in another passage of Genesis 2, where it mentions the 4 rivers. The third one, it mentions the Tigris, the Euphrates, and then it mentions the Nile. And then a fourth one, which I forget, Pishon, right? Pishon is, which I don't know where it is. Maybe scripture scholars have figured out, but these are ancient names that don't have an equivalent name today. All right, moving, now we continue. We're in verse 7 now of chapter 2 already. Then the Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. All right, now remember translator, trader, right? If we go to the Hebrew origin, it's more representative, it's more symbolic and more meaningful in my mind. The play of words that I find very interesting, there's Yahweh Elohim again, the Lord God, man of the dust of the ground he made, would be the end of this sentence, which is not represented here. But look, man is Ha-Adam, okay? Ha-Adaman, Ha-Adam. Ground or dust or earth is Ha-Adamah, Ha-Adamah. So there is a link between man and ground or earth or dust. What is this? Literally, the organic material or inorganic material that forms the earth, which itself was formed by the dust of the universe, okay? And that is why Carl Sagan had this little phrase that we are made up of the dust of the universe. Carl Sagan, who was an astrophysicist, but also he tried to popularize science and physics and astronomy way back, I think it was in the 70s or so, to bring it to lay people could understand, non-scientists and non-astronomers could understand the connection that really the dust of the universe, as it coalesces, makes planets, and then planets from that planet could have the emergence of life itself from the inorganic material passing to the organic material. Of course, this is highly speculative. This is Father Chaffee speculating, all right? But I just find it interesting that Ha-Adam and Ha-Adamah are a reference to man and dust, all right? And again, pointing out to the Miller-Urey experiment, which took the elements of the primitive atmosphere and was able to condense out organic materials eventually, including the 20 amino acids that make up all of the proteins on Earth. At any rate, the other thing I want to point out about this verse also is the breathing, the blow into his nostrils. This blow is actually the ruah, which is the breath of God, which is also the Spirit of God. The ruah is the breath of God. So here there is a connection or a link that the breath of God is also the speech of God, which is creative. And in this sense, he's blowing in life into this man made out of the clay of the earth, right? So it's, you can kind of picture it making a clay dummy and then breathing life into that dummy and Adam coming to life. So in a very sense, blowing his image, blowing God's image into the man to make him the man, God's image. And it's associated with being alive, so the soul being alive. So much so that to this day, for us who believe in the soul, we believe that the soul, at death, the soul leaves the body temporarily until that final connection at the end of time, reconnection. All right, so here's another possibility from that garden in the east, right? The Lord God planted a garden in Eden, and placed there the man whom he had formed. All right, here, this is a photograph. It's a satellite photograph of the Earth looking at the Mediterranean. You can recognize all the spots here. Here is Europe, here is Africa, and here's Asia, and here's the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. Here, this little dot is Cyprus again. So this is a fertile crescent. All right, this is a fertile crescent here. Sorry, it's not the Red Sea. This is the Red Sea here. This is the Persian Gulf. Anyway, it comes out into the Indian Sea. This is the Indian Sea. But the Fertile Crescent is here. All right? So it's in the east. Here's a little insert. And this is just a pictorial representation of what the Fertile Crescent could have looked like. Even though this terrain looks more African, and the trees, the savanna with short trees. At any rate, there's a primitive man planted in the garden, all right? Maybe still in a nomadic setting. Hunter-gatherers, for sure, because we started out as hunter-gatherers. Now, I'm going to start looking for references to the human soul or the conscience or some kind of higher capacity that other animals don't have, okay, that make us human, because what we're looking at speciation. We're looking at minimally Homo sapiens. Scientifically, we're Homo sapiens, and we would say then, if we have a soul, you would agree that all Homo sapiens would have a soul, right? Why leave any Homo sapiens without a soul? If they're the same species. Remember, species is actually defining what we would call grammatically the noun, the substance, human. What makes us human, the soul. All right. So one of those possible references that I pointed out before is the whole issue of clothing. Here is toward the end of verse 20, chapter 2. The man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. This, I think, in my mind, this has to be directly divine inspiration, because the human author wouldn't have a clue about this. We're born into a state of shame, and no one who is normal will naturally walk out as an adult, or even a teenager will walk out into the middle of the streets naked, right? Normal people. And so we have a natural pudor, we have a natural modesty about us to cover our reproductive parts and not walk around naked like that. So this issue that they were both naked and felt no shame, and it points out specifically a man and a woman, all right? So it's not a case of several men showering in a locker in the gym, or women doing the same in their woman's locker, all right? So so I consider this pretty much the Holy Spirit, the insight that before we felt shame, we did not feel shame. There was a time of innocence, in other words, okay, before the fall, because we're all born after the fall and into the fall. Then, precisely the fall, which happens on chapter 3 of Genesis, right? We all know the scenario of the temptation and the falling into the temptation. And so now Yahweh, who is that human God, that God walks with man, who had walked with Adam originally. Remember how in the previous lecture I told you about how he plays the trick on, how God plays the trick on Adam of naming, trying to find a partner, right? And parades all the animals in front of him. And he felt lonely because he couldn't find a partner. And then the creation of woman comes and so forth. So, in other words, Adam and Eve were, before the fall, were accustomed to walking with God in the forest, in Eden, that garden. Now, after the fall, what are they doing? The Lord God then called the man and asked him, "Where are you, Adam? Hello, let's have a conversation." He answered, "I heard you in the garden," which is an indirect reference again to the wind of God. "But I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid." You know, he wasn't afraid of the lions or the tigers or anything that was going to eat him, or the predators. He was afraid of his own nakedness, right? So he's starkly aware of his nakedness all of a sudden from one chapter to the next, okay? And so this modesty, this pudor starts kicking in. It's a loss of innocence. It's a loss of innocence. The Lord God made the man and his wife garments of skin with which he clothed them. All right, so God is providing for the modesty of humans after the fall, after they become aware of their own nakedness or their own attraction, which could be order or disorder. So let's try to look, because I'm trying to look for some anthropological evidence, some material culture left behind, because we cannot get into the mind and the thoughts of these people who no longer exist. They have disappeared for hundreds of thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And perhaps clothing was one aspect. It's interesting that the agreement here, the general agreement, that early modern humans in Europe utilize specialized cold weather clothing, all right? Cold weather clothing. But the nature of the clothing used by Neanderthals is debated. So again, we're trying to trace our origins phylogenetically. I think we can agree that at least in the Homo sapiens, in the species level, Homo sapiens, we were human, wherever that species developed or evolved. But how about other Homo genus that were not sapiens? Like, for example, Neanderthal, whom we coexisted for several thousand years, specifically in Europe. The clothing used by Neanderthals is debated. Some researchers contend that they did not use clothing. Others argue that they were limited to cape-like clothing. I find it interesting, cape-like, all right? Still others aver that their clothing was not substantially different in terms of thermal effectiveness from that of early modern humans. But you notice that the emphasis here is clothing for what? Well, we're using clothing right now in here for the cold. For the weather, for the cold. Again, Europe, wintertime, cold, and then you had those glaciations occurring and so forth periodically. So this looks very wintry fellow here. representing a Neanderthal. And the clothing is going to be mostly upper body clothing to try to maintain the core, because they could at least figure out intuitively that the core had to be kept warm, the warmest, right? Which is the thorax. Different from clothing around our reproductive parts, especially the primary reproductive parts, which is more for modesty and maybe hygiene. But there was no need of upper body clothing because this was more tropical environment, meaning Africa. In other words, it's considered that we started wearing clothing before leaving Africa. Before, remember, it's controversy whether it was a single wave or various waves, but we left Africa already with some kind of clothing. And it wouldn't have been necessarily an upper body clothing because we didn't need upper body clothing in a tropical environment. So what's the alternative? The alternative is going to be lower body clothing or pelvic clothing for modesty / hygiene, okay? And so this is interesting to see that this is a journal that is totally empirical, scientific. It's a journal of archaeology, and it's only 2 years ago, or 2 years to the month, making reference of clothing. If Neanderthal, what is debated here is whether Neanderthal wore clothing or not. It's not really debated, it's accepted. You see, the general agreement among anthropologists is that humans were wearing clothing already. So in my mind, that's one of, that would be like an effect of the shame. And it's interesting that it even mentions skins, right? God made skin loins, or how did you put it? God made for the man and his wife garments of skin, which requires certain elaboration, because at the human level, the skin has to be, we're not going to wear just raw hide around our bodies, okay? Aside from the fact that it was so stinky, it was probably a very stinky time that back then, not having soap and running water necessarily, but I'm sure pretty quickly they figured out that if you leave the inside of the hide clinging, it will rot pretty fast. So it had to be scraped off, you see? And this is where these tools have come in. They have found these lissoir tools, just named in French. They have this indentation, you see? And archaeologists believe that these tools were used for scraping the inside of the hide of the animal, clean of all the clingings that happen when one peels a hide off of an animal, right? You have all nerve endings and capillaries and vessels and pieces of the conjunctive tissue and shreds of muscle and so forth, all that clinging on the inside of the hide. All that had to be peeled off, all right? The outside of the hide was fine. And they use these tools for doing that, okay? Very specific, you know, it's serrated like this, okay? Really has no other known function for these kind of tools. Also, the connection is that some cultures that exist today that are ancient cultures, like the Inuits and other people that live in extreme weather conditions, to this day, they still use tools like this to clean their hides. All right, there's also the issue of the lice. The lice. Okay, so we have hair lice and we had, or head lice, and we have body lice. But it seems like originally, doing the phylogenetics on the lice, the lice genome, it gets a little weird, but this is what anthropologists do, okay? Doing the genome, the phylogenetics on the lice, it turns out that the head lice is the oldest one. It goes back to, what, about 170,000 years, okay? And we, or humans, Homo sapiens, had lice back then, big time. They were not thrown out of school, and they weren't shaved bald. Exactly. But lice was a standard thing to deal with all that head of hair, right? And they were only head lice. Then at some point, body lice appear. But it turns out that body lice, so we don't have enough hair in our body below the neck to hold the body lice except in very specific areas, but not for the body as a whole. So the body lice actually lives in the clothing. Lives in the clothing. And so there's a change in niche there that is important, significant, because the body lice developed later, I think around 40,000 years. They diverged 170,000 years ago. So it's estimated that perhaps clothing came around about 170,000 years ago. Because if body lice only live in clothing, they have to be clothing around for the divergence to the motivator. What's the motivator for the head louse to evolve into a body louse? Well, the head louse is migrating or falling off the hair and landing on the clothing and eventually adapts to that. The ones who were able to adapted. And they were selected for whatever was needed, which I can see is larger size and so forth, basically a larger abdomen for some reason, to survive in the body, and then periodically just get a bite of the human skin, which we're also shedding a lot of dead skin all the time. So that's also food for these guys. Anyway, there's an evolution here that happened about 170,000 years ago. And since these are body lice that live in clothing, it's estimated that that happened. The clothing started happening about then. Okay, so these are the references. It's all done in this past decade, studies done in this past decade, which is interesting. He's pointing out to the divergence with when we coexisted with Neanderthal between 40 to 60,000 years ago. So after the body lice had diverged. So this kind of, this argues indirectly that maybe Neanderthal also had clothing because there was clothing around already. Okay, now I have to shift gears for a moment and talk about a philosophical principle between matter and form to try to get a little bit more closely at the conscience, the spirit, the soul, right, of the human, and how when that soul could have come into being into a human body. And philosophically, we make a distinction between matter and form, but they are together inexorably, right? For example, this has the form of a microphone, and it is also made up of the matter of microphone material, matter, all right? So when we look at our surrounding, our earth, our universe, we see matter all over the place, and we see energy and the equivalency that, again, Einstein gave us between matter and energy with the speed of light, right? E equal mc squared, c being the speed of light, but E representing energy, M on the other side of the equation representing mass. So mass and energy are equivalent. Mass as the material world, something material, but we don't have mass or matter. It's always informed, always has a form, which is not just a shape, okay? I used the idea of the chair. Remember how I talked about chair originally, that we understand chair and we get the essence of chair. We understand the essence of chair, which is the noun, the substantive. And if we go to another country in the world, we look at a chair we had never seen before, but we recognize it as chair because we know what is chair as opposed to a palm tree or something else. All right, so that's the essence. And it's not really just the shape, because the shape could be very different shapes of chairs, right? And material also could be made up of metal, plastic, glass, etc. once when with my parents, my dad used to work for Alitalia when we were kids, my brother and I, and teenagers, and so we traveled once a year to Europe, to Italy, and once we were up in the Alps, and there was a cave that had been carved out of ice, and it had furniture of ice. And it was ice furniture, and I was wearing shorts, and I sat on a chair, and I had a lot of difficulty getting back up from that chair with the ice stuck to my thighs. But that was a chair, and I sat on the chair. Okay, so we recognize the essence of things. That is the form. Okay, because that informs the matter into something specific and not something else. It gives it the substantive. It gives it the noun. All right. So even if we had a clump of clay sitting here, you can say, "Well, doctor, that is a formless shape of clay. You got matter, which is the clay, and it's just a clump sitting there. All right, and it's just a shape. It has no form. No, it has a form. It has a shape, and if I put another clump of clay next to it, it has a different shape, but the form is the same. It's a clay clump. It's a clay clump, as opposed to a coconut or a brick, which is also clay, but it has a different form because it's now a brick, it's not a clump. All right, so you understand, form is a philosophical concept, but it's very real. Philosophical doesn't mean that it's fantasy or an opinion. Every matter has some form, because the form is what informs the matter into what it is, substantially, the noun, what we say it grammatically. So what is the form of the human? What is the form of man? Human, as opposed to non-human, as opposed to chimp or Neanderthal or some other. So human, man and woman, right, have the form, the human form. And that form needs to be present in order to have a human soul, because we're not going to have a human soul in a non-human form, right? Okay, so understanding that and adding, for example, the other datum of burying the dead. Burying the dead, again, we are the only animal that buries their dead. And these are the oldest caves to date, as far as I know, where there are human remains, 100,000 years for the human, and interestingly, about 50,000 years for Neanderthal. If this is truly, well, it is because of the bone structure, this is definitely a Neanderthal. It's considered to have been an actual burial, which is interesting. So Neanderthal was also burying their dead, at least some Neanderthal. These did. The friends and relatives of this fellow. Right, and speculating, so this is the most speculative part of the whole course here, speculating that one needs to have a soul in order to bury a dead. In other words, there is some belief in an afterlife, so some desire for an afterlife, even to the point of putting food in graves, which we get later in Egypt and other cultures, that they bury people dressed, and sometimes they even bury the slaves with them and everything else, because they're going on a journey, on a passage, right? All pointing to an afterlife. In contrast to any other animal, the closest to us, again, being the primates, who do nothing like that and have no concept of art, or of the symbolic pictorial representation. I'm attributing those qualities to the soul, to the spirit, to the human spirit. Okay, so when would God grant a human spirit to a human? When we have the form of human, when we finally, in other words, in that final step of speciation, when that ancestor becomes human enough to be able to receive a human soul, all right? When that happened, it's anybody's guess. It will remain a question forever, because by definition, a soul is immaterial and doesn't leave any material culture behind, as opposed to the other stuff that we find, okay? But I'm assuming, I'm just trying to tie here ends. And so God made us in his image and likeness. In my speculation, it is this. We're having evolution ongoing from the hominin family, as we saw, Australopithecines in the southern hemisphere, then the Homo genus, we're down to Homo genus. We have about 6, at least from the fossil record, 6 different species, beginning with habilis and erectus and faber, all these different Homo species, right? Eventually we get to Heidelbergensis, which is from Germany, already we're in Europe, and then Neanderthal would be the closest Homo genus to us. Mm-hmm. And at some point, eventually, sapiens. So we get this new human, and I'm almost thinking God saying, finally, you finally made it. I've been waiting for you. Here's a soul. Been waiting for you. Okay, here's a soul. Here's a human soul. You are the human. You are in my image in that. And the characteristics are immortality, innocence, and these characteristics that image us to God. Even a will, right? Will that is strong enough to control our passions and the lower instincts, if you will, which other animals cannot control. And so when that actually happened, in my mind, will continue to remain a guess, but seems to be between 1 million to 1 million to 200,000 years ago, because remember, by 200,000 years ago, we have what is known as anatomically modern human. Anatomically modern human means that if we were to see one of these primitive human, Homo sapiens, shave him and wash him and clothe him and put a suit and a tie, we would not distinguish him or her from a modern human. That's what it means, anatomically modern human, okay? Culturally, it's later. Culturally modern is much later, but anatomically, another physiologically modern human would be essentially indistinguishable from any of us today. And that's about 200,000 years ago. So who of these would qualify beyond us to also have had a soul? A human soul, okay? Because human is a reference to the genus, to Homo. I don't know how far back you want to take it, but maybe at least Neanderthal, if he was wearing clothing, maybe he was burying their dead, maybe.
Or maybe because Neanderthal, they coexist with sapiens at the time.
Coexisted, yes. In fact, they have a slightly larger cranial capacity. They have 1,500. We have on the average 1,350. But that apparently was not a selective advantage, because the standing theory is that we wiped them out in Europe specifically, which is where we coincided, and we coexisted for that 40,000 years more or less, but eventually we wiped them out. Probably just warfare, fighting for the food, fighting for territory, fighting for women, you know, that kind of thing. And they're now extinct. But we coexisted. So would we be surprised if we found a Neanderthal in heaven?
Maybe.
And did Adam and Eve have a lot of hair? Because the paintings that we have from Adam and Eve are all Renaissance Baroque paintings, even medieval paintings, but because they are the first humans, they're the perfect humans, you know, and they think that they're models out of some GQ or something magazine. But this is pointing otherwise. Yeah, this is pointing otherwise, right? Yeah. Yes, Paleolithic, yes. Yes.
How long did they live for? The lifespan of
the Neanderthal? I don't know really. That's an interesting question. I wonder. They could probably tell from the bone structure and even the tissue that is left, because we have actual tissue of Neanderthal.
The thing is, I don't know if they had enough records,
right,
to get an average.
Yes, exactly. And that's forever. That has been my case. Remember, I mentioned that earlier also. These are all fossils, right? But how do we know that these are the norm? They're representative. They may be skewed. They may be at one extreme, or small or large. Who knows? Okay, we're assuming, because that's from the very beginning. of this course, we've been talking about the paucity of the fossil record. Even as we said that the fossil record is one of the main ingredients or the main proof of evolution, the paucity of that record, right? The poorness. So, Emma, I don't know, it may be interesting. You may do a little research on that and see if it's known. Then I'm sure there's some estimates there, because for the human, it's about 80 years. It's our average lifespan. It'd be interesting to know for Neanderthal what is. Of course,
it has been increasing over time because of science.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Yeah, especially medicine, the practice of medicine. But, right. Yeah. Early lifespan was more shorter, and a big discrepancy between men and women. Right. Women typically died on the last childbirth. 40s, I think, was 40s or 40, not even 50s was the average lifespan for women before the C-section. I think it's the single most beneficial technique or medicine that has happened to the human to increase significantly the lifespan is the C-section. Of course, men typically died either with the wolf or with fighting other men. So, all right. Rounded up to mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Because these are scientific terms. These are terms used by empiricists, by scientists. And mitochondrial Eve is on the matrilineal line, and its most recent common ancestor, you see, the most recent common ancestor, that's evolutionary terminology, okay? Of all currently living humans, it is the most recent woman from whom all living humans descended in an unbroken line purely through their mothers, through our mothers, and through the mothers of those mothers back to one woman. Let me look a little bit, and just so that we're all on the same page, what do we mean by mitochondrial Eve? Because we know that when we come into existence, which is what it's going to be the next semester in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, is the fertilization of the egg by the sperm. The egg comes from the mother. And in the egg, there are these mitochondria. So this is a idealistic drawing caricature of an animal cell, all right? Idealistic because not always all of these organelles are necessarily present or in this way. Anyway, the animal cell, as you know, has a membrane, has a double membrane that has also a nucleus with another inner core of a nucleolus, which is mostly protein and RNA, etc. But the genetic material, the DNA, the genome is maintained within the nucleus, protected, which is also a double membrane, nuclear membrane. That's for eukaryotes, right? And we are eukaryotes. Then in the cytoplasm of the cell, there are other organelles because they're tiny, microscopic, and they have various functions. For example, the centromere, they're involved in the reproduction of the cell itself as the cell splits and mitosis. Lysosomes, they contain enzymes inside, lysozymes that they digest. These are for digestive purposes. Ribosomes, that's where protein synthesis occurs, etc., etc. Then we get to these others that are mitochondria, okay? One mitochondrion, several mitochondria. And they're not all this color, they're all transparent actually. So when they're looked at under the microscope, we don't see anything under the light microscope because they're transparent. But then they're stained with different dyes and they can be spotted by the eye through a light microscope, okay? Okay, so the mitochondrion is this little organelle that also has a double membrane. The outer membrane is smooth, but the inner membrane is corrugated to increase the surface area. And that's where the recharging of ATPs occurs. ATP is an energy molecule of the cell, and it's used in cellular respiration. The whole point is that these mitochondria are the energy factory of the cell, the energy factory. Okay, they recharge the energy of the cell that is used in metabolism. A cell with a mitochondria will die because it runs out of energy for metabolism. All right, so mitochondria, the theory is that they represent leftovers of another cell that was independent, maybe it was a bacterial cell that got sucked into a primitive eukaryotic cell and somehow survived the digestive process, because not only the issue of the double membrane, but also because they have a little bit of their own DNA. And this is called mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, all right? And mitochondrial DNA typically only codes for the proteins that make up the mitochondria, and even not all of the proteins, some of the proteins that make up the mitochondria. But it brings like its own little genome, if you will, its own little genetic code, the mitochondrial DNA, all right? And so scientists, being the smart fellows that they are, they sequence that mitochondrial DNA. And then they can trace the mitochondrial DNA, so they can look at your mitochondrial DNA and my mitochondrial DNA and match it up to our mother's mitochondrial DNA, and they find a very good match. Why? Because the egg that formed us came from our mother, and that egg had mitochondria in it, which are maternal mitochondria. And our moms, the same thing, comes from the egg of her mother, of our grandmothers, who also had mitochondria and so forth. And so we can trace the DNA of the mitochondria maternally back and back and back, and do a phylogenetic tree on mitochondrial DNA, which is totally maternally inherited, you see? And that, the scientists have done that, in fact, and they have come up with this tree that, coming down in time, branches out to all the cultures and all the men and women that we have in the world today. But when we go back on our maternal line, back and back and back and back, then it's like going backwards on the tree. The lines converge and converge and converge, eventually to a single woman estimated to have lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa, okay? And that is called mitochondrial Eve. Very interesting, mitochondrial Eve. Mm-hmm. Now, conversely, we can do something with the men because, you know, we live in an equal opportunity society and we don't want to leave the guys out, even though the Y chromosome is disappearing. I don't know what's going to happen when it does finally disappear. It already lost one of the legs, so I guess we might as well assert ourselves while we're here. I don't know, but it already is supposed to be an X-looking chromosome, and it's already lost one of the legs, and it's degenerating. It's losing chunks, pieces of the chromosome, because it essentially contains just very few genes, and the main gene is this SRI gene, right, that determines maleness, and also is the one that determines the sex of the child or the zygote, or depending if it's if the sperm has a Y chromosome or an X chromosome for the sex chromosome, right? And that's what determines the sex, right? So you see, on the maternal side, we're always going to inherit an X chromosome because that's coming from the egg, and women only have X chromosomes normally. But on men, so because we have XY, 50% of our sperm has X chromosome, and 50%, the other 50% in that particular ejaculate, has the Y chromosome. Just take my word for it. If you don't follow genetics yet, we'll cover it in about a month's time. But basically, the bottom line is that on men, we can trace the male through the Y chromosome, and we can do a Y chromosome analysis, a genetic analysis, and a mapping of the Y chromosome, which has already been mapped. And so when we do the mapping of only men, right, because only men have Y chromosome, on the paternal line, inherited from our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, trace it back also approximately to the same range, maybe a little older, 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, but also in Africa. okay? And that's the phylogenetics of the Y chromosome analysis. And so that fellow is called Y chromosome Adam, just from using the biblical reference. Now, having said all that, it's important to understand that these do not refer exactly to the biblical Adam and Eve, all right, as the first human, because these are a little bit of a moving target. In other words, since this is an uninterrupted genetic line, all right, phylogenetic line, as we lose connectivity in older generations, then that causes an interruption. And so Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve are kind of moving targets on the genealogy, on the phylogenetics. Because if we lose the continuity, then it breaks, okay? And so the point is that it could have been between, let's say, if we take the two boundaries, 150 to 300,000 years ago, that the Homo sapiens came into being, or it could have been older. We just don't have record that goes that far back, okay? But it goes, we can say that it goes at least this far back, at least this far back. So when we take this, all of this data together from the phylogenetics, and you notice that this is at the molecular level of the evidence for evolution and speciation. The burying of the dead, for example, is more at the cultural level. So is the clothing issue, right? Because that's material culture or evidence that's been left behind. So we go again back to the question, who of these, how far back can we go and posit a soul, a human soul? Because human is a reference to Homo, to the genus level. Very speculative. Here are some conclusions. The biblical narrative of creation from Genesis 1-3 does not necessarily contradict the process of evolution or the evidence that we have from the fossil record and the phylogenetics, all right? Rather, there is a certain parallelism or a certain sequencing. The sequences match up in the big picture. Excuse me, on the biblical narrative and on the fossil record evidence of speciation, that gradual speciation, and even before life, of the origin of the universe. Key moments coincide on both sides, okay? With regards to the human, trying to bring the evidence from tool making and art, for example, which has always had a religious or quasi-religious or at least superstitious element to it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, earlier, even more so. In fact, up until the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, most art was pretty much religious art. Mm-hmm. But for the primitive, for Paleolithic cultures, art is estimated to have had a very religious or superstitious type of associated with magic and trying to harness the powers of the gods to get their food and to trap the animals that they needed to catch for food. Okay. So possibly anywhere the range could be from as far back as 1 million years ago to minimally 200,000 years ago, where we have anatomically modern humans, okay? There's the range approximately where we have the emergence of Homo sapiens as such, and we would posit a soul on them. Going back, did Neanderthal have a soul? Big question. About Heidelbergensis, to my knowledge, there has not been found any Heidelbergensis cave or a burial site or clothing. But again, who knows, maybe tomorrow that fossil is discovered. Okay, so it's obviously the further back we go, the more open question. So that's basically it. The reality that maybe Adam and Eve did not look as pretty as we would like them to look, all right, according to our standard, right? But that's, that's the difference between exegesis and eisegesis, right? Some people get turned off, and I can tell you because I speak with a lot of my Catholic friends and family members, and they will be taken aback with something like this because they have this idealistic picture of Adam and Eve as some kind of models straight out of some gorgeous magazine. And they exempt Adam and Eve from the process of evolution. I don't know why, but at least from Genesis and the Bible in general, and even our Catholic faith as such, we don't really have a problem with evolution as long as it doesn't question the possibility of the existence of God precisely as creator. Okay, that's all I have. Questions or comments, please?
One of my, when I think about it, is with reproduction. Let's say, we have the first human.
Right.
In the evolution process.
Exactly.
And there was male and female. So at some point there has to be,
yes.
God created between the evolution process, a male and a female.
Right.
There was reproduction, and then how the other generations came about.
Yes.
So were there more than one couple created?
Exactly. Yeah.
In order to, to populate the world.
Correct.
Or in different parts of the world could have been too.
Yeah. Very good. I'm glad for the question because that is something that was a prior debate that was called monogenism versus polygenism. Did we come from a single human or several humans? And biologically, it doesn't make a difference. In other words, whereas we could think maybe, I don't know, existentially, certainly we make a difference between individuals and we know if it's one or more than one, right? Individuals. However, biologically, a small group genetically is as if they were one. I've heard this of the cheetah, for example. There's such few cheetah in Africa today, I think it's maybe around 200 or 300 of them left, that genetically, as far as evolution and natural selection is concerned, they are as if they were one species. In other words, the gene pool is so reduced. They all come from very closely related individuals, parents, okay, that they are almost as if they were siblings of each other. And so, as far as the gene pool is concerned, there's very little diversity among them, okay? And so they are biologically considered as if they were a single individual, these 200 or 300 cheetah that are left in Africa, all right? So that's why monogenism or polygenism was a big argument early on, but it has been dropped in the church. You don't see theologians talking about this anymore. Even Pope Pius XII made a declaration, I think it was Pius XII, one of the Pius, but it was before the Vatican Council in the early part of the 1900s, that we descended from monogenistic line, in other words, from a single man and woman whom we call Adam and Eve, all right? But it was a little speculative, and at this point, we wouldn't argue with that point, because again, with mitochondrial Eve and chromosome Adam, Y chromosome Adam, we can get to a single man and woman. How does diversity occur? How do variants occur, and how do they survive? Because we also have the knowledge from medicine, right, that incest and inbreeding will degenerate the race and the species. Exactly. And so even Darwin was married to a cousin, by the way. He was married to a cousin. But it was not known earlier that that was wrong, that would generate abnormal children or infertile children and so forth. That ends, right? But it's not as common in other species. We see other species that they have their children and those siblings can mate, and the anomaly is not set in very strongly, all right? There's still, and I don't know exactly how that happens, but they still get diversity, enough diversity. I'm thinking, for example, mice, lab mice are inbred all the time, and yet you get viable mice at every litter drop, you know, and even those siblings can be inbred and still continue to get fertile mice from their offspring, okay? So the genetics is complicated, you know, it's not as simple as we would like it to be, but that argument can be made in general for any new species that arises. If you think of it again, let's try to go back organically, and we are at the edge of speciation of a new, it would be a variant, right? So we would have, remember polymorphisms and the variants, because selection is acting on the variants. So until the climate changes, the norm is what prevails, and the variants, by definition, outside the norm, they're less fit, and so they're constantly losing out. But then there is an environmental change. There's typically a climate change that is pretty drastic, maybe even catastrophic, like a meteor coming in and impacting and all that, will wipe out a whole series of species that were predators on this other species. And now it may make a difference, the variants in this other species that got to survive, the new variants the variants that are off the norm may have a selective advantage in the new environment, in the new climate, okay? So, but that applies for speciation in general. And we can trace that kind of chronologically throughout these fellows, because I did trace them chronologically, beginning with habilis and then rudolfensis and so forth, at an average, I'm just saying kind of out loud, of about 500,000 years each, roughly, all right? So how do these other guys come up and manage to survive? They also have to come up from a very small clan of variants that biologically could be considered as a single individual, but existentially, they're actually various individuals. There may be siblings, there may be cousins, all right? But they manage to survive with this new change. So the same argument could be made for the human itself. It goes back to that form, matter form thing. When that new hybrid, or whatever you want to call it, that new variant evolved and emerged, that it had the form that could receive, and I'm thinking mostly it was going to be on the brain, because the rest, I mean, think of it, again, functionally. From the neck down is basically maintaining the head alive, right? Organically. Biologically, it's maintaining the head alive. Yeah. The head itself cannot maintain itself, it needs food and so forth, but it's coming from the neck down. And so circulation and all that, it's a support system for the brain. And so if we were to posit the soul, where would we posit the soul? And if we have to deposit the soul in a vital organ, we put it in a vital organ, right? We're not going to put it in a non-vital organ. We would put it on the brain, right? And even more so on the cortex, even though we say the brain, the actual soul is in the whole body, we are body and soul one. John Paul II would be upset at me talking this way because I'm making kind of a duality between the body and the soul. But just for purpose of analysis, we know that we have a substantial integration between the body and the soul. But I can also think organically and existentially, a quadriplegic or a person who's missing both arms and both legs is still alive, is still human, is still fully human, highly handicapped, but fully human, has a soul, okay? Then if we start substituting vital organs, let's say we put in artificial kidneys, artificial hearts, artificial livers, and we start substituting the vital organs, substantially we would still have, theoretically, we would have a human being, right? A fully human being, though it's highly bionic. as long as we leave the brain intact, I think that we will still have a human being, a fully human being with a soul. And so taking a track like a minimalist track, I would put the soul in the brain when push comes to shove. When the brain develops to the point that it can receive a human soul, we can call that a human brain. The matter has the form of a human brain. God posits the soul there. And that obviously had to happen in more than one individual, because that would have been a dead end. And it had to happen minimally in a man and a woman for the reproduction, because we didn't invent sexual reproduction, we inherited from ancestors of ancestors of ancestors. Mm-hmm. And therefore, all that had to be in place, anatomically had to be in place for God to give a soul. But like the ancestor, the immediate ancestor of this new being, of this new human, was not fully human. So God had to wait for the next generation. And in the next generation, finally, maybe not even all the variants, maybe only one of the variants, who knows, was human enough to receive. In other words, their brain was human enough to receive a human soul, to receive conscious.
It was created until there was the perfect individual to
yes,
the soul.
Exactly, but perfect how? Perfect in the sense of human, fully human, biologically, organically, materially, formally. And then, but the prerogative of the soul is definitely God's. Okay, because our parents, at most, they gave us the biology, but they did not give us the soul. In fact, they couldn't give us the soul because one of the characteristics of the soul is that it's individual and it's simple, meaning that it's not in parts. So where is my soul going to come from? My father? Like my father gave me maybe a quarter of his soul or 2/3 of his soul, and then my mother gave me 2/3 of her soul, and then combined those to get a new soul for me. No, because the soul is simple, cannot be divided. It's indivisible. And so it has to be a unique creation every time. And my whole point here is, if it is a creation ontogenetically, meaning for each individual one of us, when we were fertilized, we were created by our parents biologically, God then created our soul then. That's what I call ontogenetically, for the ontos from the being, individual being. Why not phylogenetically also? In other words, just follow the whole race, the whole species back until that original Adam and Eve, whoever they were, where God posited the soul. And so if we look at it from that perspective, in my mind at least, it doesn't contradict the evolutionary process. Because there was a time when we were not human, and it was just the prior generation. Maybe it was my great-great-grandfather was not human, but then my great-grandfather, his son, was human. Human enough to receive a soul. What do you think of that?
And couldn't we think like, I don't know, maybe when in the Bible they refer to Adam and Eve
right.
in the creation,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they refer to the first human with the soul.
Well, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Remember, Adama just means man in Hebrew. Okay, it's not his first name as opposed to Louis or Michael. All right, it just means man.
So this could explain.
And Eve comes from Ewa, which means woman. And in fact, even in the word in man, woman is Old English. Wu means of. W-O, wu man means of man. Mm-hmm. And human is we're still with man as the first human. Okay.
So we could explain that they were all humans.
Yes, it was whoever they were, these primitive humans. Mm-hmm. Now, in my mind at least, the big question was it exclusive to Homo sapiens? Because human is a reference to Homo, right? At the level of genus. But was it a reference exclusive to Homo sapiens? Or could we also include Neanderthal in there, for example, which is the other fossil record that is closest to us, right? At least from the fossil record. It may be that tomorrow there's a new fossil that's discovered that is even closer to us and after Neanderthals that just hasn't been discovered yet. Okay? So there's a lot of unknowns there, but at least my whole point, the whole course, is that if we are fair with the biblical narrative, but also fair and honest to the fossil record and the phylogenetics and all that, we can maintain both creation and evolution of the human, let alone the rest of the universe, but of the human, and come up with God as the creator of the human. Okay? That's my whole point. And so, therefore, but you notice also it's a very Catholic point in the sense of how we're interpreting the Bible.
Right, because the fundamentalists, if they
would take exception to this, they would be calling me a heretic right now. I'd be burned to the stake by this point by showing this as possible humans, you know.
Yes. Yeah, it would be interesting to listen that point of view of the
right.
But yeah. You have a student here, Carlos, that I really
not so far.
Interesting, no?
It would be, but I think that they wouldn't feel as attracted to this program as such, you know. But they do have, and I'll tell you what they do have. They have a theory that is a quasi-scientific theory, but it doesn't really have a credibility among the scientists, and it's called, what do they call it? Intelligent design. Intelligent design, okay? Intelligent design is coming out of the Protestant camp, trying to justify the complexity that we see in nature on the one side, but also the undeniability of the fossil record, that there have been some creatures that existed before us and are no longer around or extinct, right? So they don't deny what is that level of evidence. What they deny is the actual evolving of one species into another, and especially for the human. And even some fundamentalists may even accept perhaps an evolution of other animals and plants, but not the human. That's really where they draw the line, okay? And they say with the human, it is, well, it's just intelligent design. In other words,
the human design is...
Yes, that God is this intelligence. So they're taking the word God out of the equation simply because they want to have a language to speak with scientists. And they know that scientists can't say anything about God because it cannot be measured. But they say intelligent design. There is this intelligence in the universe that is so wise that it's able to design the complexity that we see in the human today. And another catchphrase of them is irreducible complexity. And you know, the one organ that they point to is the eye. That the eye is so complex, the human eye is so complex, right, that it could not have evolved. There's no logical explanation for the evolution of the eye because it's so intrinsically complex. And that's what they call irreducible complexity, because the argument in evolution is that generally a more complex structure evolves from a simpler structure, all right? And how do you get, for example, an eye, not a compound, but an eye like ours, from an eye spot, for example, in planaria, in flatworms, that can only barely distinguish between light and darkness. But they don't have anywhere the complexity that we have, anywhere near, all right? And so they say that irreducible complexity, they call it irreducible complexity, points to an intelligent design, and an intelligent design points to an intelligent designer, who is the supreme being whom we call God. And so man was created, man and woman, the human was created just as we see them today from the very start, and we are exempt from evolution. That's their argument. But they're trying to push this intelligent design as if it were a scientific theory, but it's not. The scientists have seen through it and they don't accept it. You know, rightly so, because it doesn't have a scientific grounding. It doesn't have a grounding in nature, all right? Certainly, they would deny natural selection, they would deny phylogenetics and the molecular evidence for the phylogenetic map and all that. So that's the challenge there. And then some may accept some degree of evolution with other animals, but certainly not the human. Right? They're stuck there because God created us in His image and likeness, and His image and likeness He created us.
When you study the Bible, theology,
right?
Because I know there have the other religions that also go to their, to the universities and they study theology.
Right.
So what is the difference between Catholic theology and Protestant theology?
Yeah, again, is this whole issue of how we interpret the Bible. All right, that seems to be, we're kind of locked there. I haven't seen any substantial progress. Of course, I'm not a biblical scholar either, right? But I have not seen substantial progress made in that area, except in a few very restricted study groups and individuals who are more open-minded, both on the Catholic side and on the Protestant side. But for the general public, no, definitely not. They're locked into sola scriptura, interpreting the Bible literally. They don't even accept all the books that we accept, but they do accept also the books from the Old Testament that we accept. Plus, at the end of the day, think about it. The real bone of contention is just Genesis 1 and 2, right? It's 2 chapters of one of 73 books, and Genesis, by the way, has 50 chapters. But that one, because of this whole thing of origins and creation, and you just can't see God collaborating, if you will, with his own, the laws of nature that he himself created. And so they're just stuck there. And maybe part of it is also my ignorance of their arguments, but they really have a difficulty in not interpreting the Bible literally. Mm-hmm. So they're stuck with this day of 24 hours and so on and so forth, even though the evidence is, like I pointed out, is an internal evidence of the text itself. Yeah. It's challenging. It gets to a point where I'm bewildered because I don't see why they don't see it.
That's the way we feel.
Yeah.
But, that's the difference when you have some science background also.
Yes.
And
yes.
That's the biggest argument. You cannot talk to somebody that has not a science background.
Right. That's the biggest challenge there, and that's why I find, for example, in Respect Life, also in Pro-Life, I kept thinking of why would a mother ever want to kill her child in the womb? Okay. It's just simply out of ignorance and out of the lack of background and fear and all the other things. But all those emotions in the moment are so strong that they totally glance over the fact that this is another human being as unique as the mom herself and everything else,
And it goes to the other way too. Is it possible to speak to someone who doesn't have a Catholic or religious background because they're so science and evolution and God doesn't exist?
It's just totally empirical.
Yeah, and that's not life. It's just zygote, so you can get rid of it. So
it's a clump of cells. I was talking to, I was in a program just about a week ago or so, on the occasion of the He Huangcui is his name, the scientist who claimed to have cloned humans, edited the human genome about 3 weeks ago or so. Yeah, so there have been some TV programs and some news items, and I've been on some panels. Anyway, we'll talk about that in the next course, for sure. But one of the panelists in the panel in Telemundo was, he's the IVF scientist, doctor for one of the most successful IVF clinics in town, all right? And him and I got into this issue of when does life begin? So I asked him point blank, so the zygote, the morula, the blastula, the blastocyst, which implants, the blastocyst implants, a week later, 5 to 7 days later, what's the blastocyst with? It's a clump of cells. It's a clump of cells. It's not human until it implants. It's not human until it implants. And so that's how he can justify tanks of cryopreserve, in liquid nitrogen, hundreds of thousands of these humans in these tanks in suspended animation, because they're just a clump of cells. And he's convinced to the core, and he's very respectful of life, of course, and he's extremely happy that he has been able to create these human lives for all these couples who couldn't have them otherwise. And how appreciative they are. They consider him a semi-god for creating this.
It kills me when they are the in vitro fertilization and they have a few eggs that have maybe like 5.
Right.
And the couple only wants, one. Wow. And they have to kill the rest.
Kill them all, right? Yeah. Right, because it's hyperovulation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it could be a dozen easily.
It's a lot.
Exactly.
It's a lot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I see that you're interested in the topic for the next course, which is what we're going to get into, precisely beginning of life. Okay.
Hopefully I'll be here, Father.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly.
I don't know yet.
Yes, you will.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. No. Don't worry. Don't worry. Definitely here. Okay. So basically, thank you very much for sticking with it. Okay. And yes, indeed. Kairos. Chronos and Kairos. All right. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas with your family and friends. And we'll see you next year in a couple of weeks, about 3 weeks, for the beginning of life course. All right.
January 12th
Yes, but 12th is actually a Monday. I mean, no, 12. No, you see.
I think we started the 8th.
Right. So we don't, because the classes actually start on the 12th, which is a Monday. Give me a minute here. I'll just.
Saturday is the 12th.
Saturday is the 12th. Yeah.
Yeah, but classes are beginning start on the 14th. Classes start on the 14th, which is a Monday.
So we start the 19th.
So we started 19. Yes, we started 19. And by the way, since I'm still recording, the syllabi are already posted, so you can get into. You know how to get into Canvas. You go to My Bobcat and then Canvas. I'll show you briefly since we're still here. Just for the record, you have it. All right. So let's see. You know how to get to this website, right? Just put stu.edu and punch it in. Then My Bobcat. Okay. And then Canvas, the first link here. Canvas. It's a portal where we have all the courses. So you have a Canvas account. You see the menu here on the left. You see courses. You go to courses. And of course, this is my Canvas. This is my courses. But for you, you will have beginning of life. Here it is. Spring of 19. This is the course there. Click in there. There's a syllabus. You can download it. And the same for end of life is also here. Oops. I go back to courses. Excuse me. End of life is here. Right? The same. There's the syllabus. So you can download it. And the most important part of the syllabus, as far as I'm concerned, is the calendar. So we'll do the first half on beginning of life and the second half of end of life. That way we can maintain the same rhythm of Saturday morning classes. All right, and don't have to add another class. Emma, question?
If we already completed statistic course, we have to retake it here?
It depends. Is it a graduate school? Is it graduate statistics or undergrad? Yeah. Okay, if it's grad, yes, send me the transcript and I'll try to get a substitute, try to get a course substitute for that. All right, but if as long as it was graduate school, most likely we'll be able to substitute it for the one that we're going to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're lucky.
Yes. Yes. So
first.
check your records with a fine comb and see if you find anything close to our statistics there.
After the bachelor.
Yeah, after the bachelor, it have to be a graduate level. So it have to be like a 500 or 600 level course, you see, because typically we have a statistic course for undergraduate in the sciences, but that doesn't count for graduate school. That's the challenge, yeah. Unless it was one of the mixed courses. Sometimes there are mixed courses that are undergrad/grad, for example, 400/500. I took some of those courses at Purdue that were 400/500. So maybe we could make an argument with that one. But if it's strictly undergrad, 400 or lower, it won't count, unfortunately. Okay? All right. Thanks again. And Merry Christmas to everybody. Get some sweets on your way back. Thank you for those who are online. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.